Hi everyone, this is Notia Spencer and welcome back again to my hobby channel. Today we start with a new series of videos, this time another Tamiya 1/48 scale model, the T-55 Soviet tank. As always with this type of kits, the assembly is very straightforward and there are no issues. Today's video will be about priming with different colors, base coating, also highlights will be applied, and finally I will create some chipping effects over the main color. I'll catch you after this. This particular vehicle is supposed to represent one of the tanks of the German Democratic Republic shown in the photos from the Checkpoint Charlie incident in 1961. The assembly was almost out of the box. As seen in photos, I did not glue most of the turret lights and the infrared system. And because chunks of the photos seem like T-54/T-55, I added the ventilator piece on the top of the turret next to the loader hatch. A small blanket was sculpted with 2 parts epoxy putty, and I used copper wire with different diameters for representing the turret handles. Tracks were glued together with the wheels in a whole compact piece, and to finish the assembly I added some basic details like the texture of the turret with some Tamiya putty. Just before painting, I realized that there was a big detail missing. Tanks in Berlin photos had their tactical numbers covered by some kind of rectangular pieces. For some reason, Germans wanted to hide the armored unit. For representing these rectangular pieces, I take some Tamiya masking tape, and I cut it into several pieces. I didn't use any metallic ruler because I wanted them to look like handcrafted. On the model, I placed them where the tactical numbers should be painted, trying to overlap them, and bending the corners too for a more used appearance. Okay, so before painting, I also cleaned the surface with the standard alcohol cleaning method. This stage will remove all the small particles of dust and sanding from the plastic surface. Cleaning the surface really makes a difference when starting painting. I plan to create some chipping effects on the grey main color of the model, and for this I have to apply a rusty priming layer below that green color. For this purpose I take Vallejo German red-brown surface primer. This color will work for representing the red oxide primer applied on most military vehicles, not just necessarily the German ones. Applying this type of primers is always recommendable, because they will make your paint job much easier and create a better surface for the upcoming paint layers. In my case, this type of primers work really well. They unify the surface and also have good covering capabilities, also with resin and metallic parts. I start by applying thin coats over the model, leaving them to dry. You should pay attention to the different recesses and holes because sometimes the paint doesn't cover them at first. This color will act as the original primer of the vehicle, and it will be seen through the chipped paint. When a second coat is applied, the results will be much better. The turret received the same amount of paint with the red color, and just like with the hood, I care about getting a smooth finish. Getting an even coat of primer on the turret will unify the surface, and will help to the next paint layers to stick better. For the trucks, I'm going to use a different approach. This is the first time I make it, so I hope it will work fine. Because all the trucks and wheels have been glued together, I will prime these parts in a very dark grey, almost black, and later I'll paint the wheels in green. This grey primer will act as the dark underneath coat, and also I hope it works like a pre-shadowing effect. Because the color is very dark, it is very easy to cover the pieces. I just needed to apply some passes over the external part of the trucks to get a solid covering. Because wheels will be chipped too, I airbrushed some red primer inside the wheels. Well, once primer has been applied, I take now the chipping fluid from Ammo MIG. After watching some tutorials about it, I decided to use it directly with my airbrush. This chipping fluid has a thicker consistency than I expected. But once I started airbrushing it, I realized that it flows nice. As my first experience with this type of products, I have to recognize it. I didn't know about how many layers should be applied for getting a good chipping result. Because I read the number of chipping coats depends on the amount of time you let them dry, I went for 2 nice even coats on all the model. All in all, I'll keep my fingers crossed. Surprisingly, the chipping fluid dries very fast and does not leave any type of residue on the surface. Once dry, you can see the chipping fluid layer. So I moved quickly to the base coating. Before applying the base color, I took Tamiya XF61 and, as its own name says, it is a dark green which will work very nice for a shadow color. Applying a darker shade of green on the vertical parts of all the little metal boxes on the tank will create a color contrast very effective. I try to cover all the vertical plates and hidden parts of the tank. Also, I applied some paint on the inner part of the fenders. For example, here I paint the lower part of the fuel tanks. Parts with higher depth, like engine deck, will benefit as well of the dark greenish tone, and I use it too to cover the engine grills. Alright, so to create our German T-55 color I used Tamiya NATO Green. Pretty ironic color for a Soviet tank, isn't it? Okay, so no jokes here. NATO green color, when applied with no camouflage around, creates a nice green with a slightly yellow shade. Very similar to the colors applied on this type of vehicles. On the wheels, as planned before, green is only airbrushed inside the wheels, and unlikely the result is not as I expected at all, I think it still works. On the main hull and turret, I try to apply green coats as thin as possible. Maybe, if I leave them thin, they will be easier to chip and scratch later. Apart from covering the red primer areas, it is important now to avoid painting the dark green areas, if not, we will ruin the result. Because Tamiya acrylics are exceptional for airbrush painting, they become very useful for applying thin coats. In this case, I only needed 2 coats of paint to cover all the surface. Okay, so it's time for adding some highlights. I added to the previous NATO green a 50% mix with these 2 colors. When creating lighter shades of green, I recommend to add small amounts of paint, avoiding creating excessive light colors. I applied this color on the horizontal parts and the frontal sloped areas and fenders. On the main armor, I applied some thin straight lines, which will give us some pretty striking effect finish. On the rest areas, I go this time for a cloudy applying pattern. Creating small shapes and not covering completely the layer underneath generates some kind of weather, contrasted and more textured surface. When painting the turret, I focus in highlight the main volumes and hatches. And because it has a rounded shape, I try to concentrate the lighter color in the upper and central areas. Moving now with a second highlight, I added more yellow-green and sky green to the previous color. This time I applied this last highlight in a more restrictive way. It is key to not to cover all the surface, because we need the colors underneath to create a whole effect. Also, cloudy pattern application is still useful at this point. You can see how the application is very uneven and most of the pieces are not covered at all. This last highlight creates a more desaturated look on the tank, which becomes very realistic. On the upper areas I create some heavier thin lines, especially on the turret sides, and I applied some more contrast on the crew hatches. That's the result for now. With all the tank being base coated and highlighted, the contrast created with the green colors combination has become very natural in my opinion. By this time I have to confess I felt really stressed about the chipping fluid coat, because I didn't know if it was gonna work at all. So there is no time to waste. I felt like if there was a countdown on my workbench. Talking about chipping itself, as always I started with the less exposed areas. This time I began with the wheels. I started pre-moistening the surface with tap water. First I began using a soft brush, just to keep in contact and getting used with the technique. I think that it is pretty easy to create some chipping. I started to scratch the surface with the brush, drawing scratches. On the running gear, I started by scratching the main edges of the wheels, and paint started removing by itself. Final result also depends on the pressure you applied and the brush you use. I started changing my brushes and using different types. I have to say that the more deteriorated brush tips become very handy for creating this type of effects. On the main hull, the chipping grade effect depends on the area. In this case, the exhaust protective plate is a perfect candidate for heavy chipping. This type of plates usually are heavily weathered because of the high temperatures they are exposed to. Creating chipping becomes very easy on the more exposed areas and edges of the model. Once the surface is pre-moisted, it is as simple as apply soft passes with the brush. Also becomes very interesting changing the position of the model, so I applied the brush strokes in a different direction, which will be more natural and will bring more variety to the effect. Depending on the result I looked for, I applied more passes or not. Using an old brush with a weathered brush tip allows me to create bigger chipping effects, especially on the main axes of the tank. Also, small oil and fuel caps are perfect candidates for chipping. Another consideration to keep in mind is that it is not a good idea to leave the paint moisted too much time. If you do, paint will be removed much easily and will be harder to control the effect. On the fuel tanks I found more resistant in the paint. It was harder to scratch the paint layer even applying more pressure with the brush. Maybe this was due to the drying times of the chipping fluid, but I'm not completely sure. The thing is, because of that resistance, the result was not so controllable at all, but I think the result at least is very decent. On the turret I focused in create chipping in the main hatches and areas where the crew gets inside the vehicle. On the turret roof I started scratching the surface around the main welds of the armor and the flat areas. Also, other elements such as handles, lift hooks and so on received the round amount of chipping. So there you have. Now the T-55 has been chipped completely, and I think that the result is very nice, but I should practice more this technique further in the future. My impressions about this product are good, but it should be applied always in a well-controlled situation to be able to get the best finish as possible. Alright, for finishing the base coat, I applied a satin protective varnish coat made from a 50% mix between matte and gloss varnishes from Vallejo. And because this model does not need any decals, there is no reason to apply gloss varnish. This coat will protect the thin base coat from future and more aggressive weathering techniques. At the same time, it unifies the model surface, creating a nice semi-glossy look. Okay, so time for some finished footage. You might see how all of these different stages have come up. The green main color is very accurate in my opinion. The highlighting with both yellow and grey colors gives an extra shade of faded green. Also, highlights in combination with the shadow tone create a nice contrast in the tank. About the chipping, personally, I would have liked to control better the effect. The result is not unpleasant for my taste, but let's say I was looking for a lighter chipping result. All in all, and keeping in mind this is my first approach, I feel very satisfied with the model. In these last seconds, you have also some detailed photos of my model at this stage. That's all for now. On the next episodes, there will be plenty of techniques coming like oil rendering, some acrylic detailing, and of course paint washes. Please consider to give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Also, make sure you get subscribed to the channel if interested in this type of content, and to hit the bell to receive notifications from the upcoming videos. As always, thanks for watching, and I see you in the next one.